10 wrestling podcasts all wrestling fans should listen to. Number 10. The Art of Wrestling with Colt Cabana. Starting back in 2009, The Art of Wrestling is arguably the most influential wrestling podcast of all time, with its huge success inspiring countless others, bigger wrestling names to start their own, which has seen the landscape totally change. However, they always say there's something about the original that strikes with people, and that is the case with Cabana's podcast. People might have really started to listen after CM Punk's infamous episode, but his library offers amazing interviews with the very best in the sport. Often imitated but never duplicated, The Art of Wrestling kick-started the wave of podcasts and still remains popular to this day as Colt continues to change things up in order to keep the show fresh. Number 9. The Jim Cornette Experience. Admittedly, this is one that fans either love or hate. It's like mustard. Whether you should listen to this all really depends on how you feel about Jim Cornette as a person, as he's certainly one of wrestling's most divisive figures. If Cornette is someone you like, then this podcast is without a doubt a must listen for you because it provides everything you would expect from him. Cornette holds nothing back and is almost guaranteed to start talking himself into trouble at some point throughout each show. Cornette is quite critical of the current day product, so if that's not something you are interested in, then steer away. But you wouldn't expect anything less from him. You're guaranteed to hear exactly how he feels, and that is refreshing in the modern day, which is why it's a fun show whether you agree with his opinion or not. Number 8. Pro Wrestling Torch. This is a much different show than many of the famous wrestling podcasts that most people push today, with Wade Keller's Pro Wrestling Torch being very journalistic as he breaks down everything going on in wrestling during each show. Pro Wrestling Torch will always have live shows directly after Raw and SmackDown, breaking the shows down immediately after they finish, often speaking to a fan who was live in attendance that night, which offers a different perspective. Not only that, but the Torch also has interviews which are done in a more journalistic manner, rather than listening to two friends just having a catch up and talking about the old times, which might be your cup of tea. Number 7. Talk is Jericho. Talk is Jericho isn't strictly just a wrestling podcast, hence why it ranks a little lower on the list, because if it wasn't for that fact, it would certainly be higher as the podcast is of superb quality and provides brilliant humor. As the title suggests, the podcast is hosted by WWE legend Chris Jericho, which is already a reason to be listening, as hearing Jericho tell stories about the wrestling business is always fun. And he isn't one of those people that only speak positive about WWE either, offering harsh critique when needed. However, it is in Jericho's interview segments where this podcast really comes alive, as listening to him talk to other wrestlers is a lot of fun. He provides a really easy to listen to, engaging and funny conversation with all of his guests, and is certainly one for fans to listen to. Number 6. Wrestling Observer. Similar to Pro Wrestling Torch, the Wrestling Observer podcast offers fans a chance to hear a more analytical look at the current day product, rather than former WWE stars simply talking about the past. Dave Meltzer and Brian Alvarez are two of the most well-respected wrestling journalists in the world, and these spend countless hours watching everything from WWE's top main events to the independents around the world. Because of this, it means they provide fans with news and information about everything in wrestling, not just what is happening in WWE, though they do dedicate plenty of time to that as well. Hearing them give detailed analysis on everything that is going on is always worth a listen. Number 5. Chasing Glory with Lillian Garcia. One of the newer podcasts on this list, Lillian Garcia has ventured into the wrestling podcast and been a huge success in doing so, which really shouldn't take anyone by surprise considering how talented she is. Garcia interviews the very top names in WWE, but she does so in a slightly different way, really looking at them as people and trying to work out what makes them tick and how they have managed to come as far as they have in their careers. Lillian does a great job hosting the show, and her interviews are incredibly engaging. To say she has only been doing the gig for a short period of time, she seems very comfortable in the role, and this podcast should only go from strength to strength from now on. Number 4. Something to Wrestle with Bruce Pritchard. The fact that WWE has brought several episodes of this specifically to the WWE Network should be a clear sign as to why this is one of the very best wrestling podcasts available right now. Bruce Pritchard and Conrad break down a new topic every episode, delving deep into the history of WWE, covering the most controversial and well-known topics from Pritchard's time working with Vince McMahon. The pair have great chemistry, and putting a fan like Conrad with someone with as much knowledge as Pritchard makes a very engaging conversation, as you can tell Conrad is just as interested as we are listening to it. It's something very different than most wrestling podcasts out there, but it works and you should check it out. Number 3. The Steve Austin Show. If you're a die-hard wrestling fan, then this is a must-listen show. Getting to hear from one of the very greatest of all time in Stone Cold Steve Austin, all while he relaxes in his own environment and shoots a breeze. Austin brings you exactly what you expect from the Texas Rattlesnake, pulling no punches with his questions during interviews, always asking the hard questions that many other podcast hosts fail to do, which often leads to some fantastic interviews. Number 2, ENC Pod of Awesomeness. If you're looking for a good time and to simply have fun with the podcast, then there's no better option than ENC Pod of Awesomeness, a show which is guaranteed to have you bursting out with laughter throughout. Edge and Christian's chemistry is something that has served them incredibly well throughout their careers, and that just continues on their podcast. They don't take themselves too seriously and are happy to make jokes at their own expense, which allows guests to be much more comfortable. While there are a lot of laughs with this podcast, they do also break down the business, giving their expert opinions, and the fact they have 2 hosts makes the interview segment very interesting and different to most podcasts. Just be aware, if you're listening to this in public, you may get some strange looks from all the giggling you'll be doing. Number 1, Sam Roberts Wrestling Podcast. If you weren't aware of Sam Roberts prior to his WWE gig, then you likely are now, with WWE recognizing the brilliant work that Sam puts in his wrestling podcast, which led to the company hiring him to be on the WWE kickoff shows. Because Sam is a radio host for SiriusXM, his own wrestling podcast follows the same quality you should expect, and he breaks his podcast down into 2 distinct segments. Sam always has an interview segment and then a segment he calls the State of Wrestling. This is where Sam breaks down the top 5 stories in the world of wrestling, providing fans with the best of both worlds, hitting fans with a really fun, in-depth interview, as well as talking about the top stories. The best part about Sam's podcast is that he's just a fan at heart, and you can really get that vibe from him, with Sam simply wanting to take a positive approach to the product, which is how fans should see wrestling.